about, mainly Peter's denial. Chad, if you want to flip the middle light back on, back up there, that'll work. And then, because I can't read everything, otherwise we'll be here all night. So, John chapter 18. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who was betraying him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. And we'll jump down to verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But what if I said is right? Why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Then verse 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered into his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answers, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered them over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the Place of the Skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and is written in Aramaic and Latin and in Greek. The account that I just read you here in the book of John really brings home what happened, right? Pilate wants to release him, yet the Jews demand his blood. They demand that he be crucified. And as we come back to the question that I raised on Sunday morning about who is Jesus and who everyone thinks he is, right? We see Pilate wondering, who is Jesus, right? Where are you from? Who are you? What'd you do? We see a group of guards coming, asking for Jesus of Nazareth. And what do they get? They get a lot more than they thought they were getting. I can tell you that much. And we'll look at that here this evening. When we looked at the crowd who was hailing him as the king of the Jews on Sunday, on Palm Sunday, when he was coming in on the triumphal entry. We saw the religious elite, and we saw them again here tonight, how they wanted to crucify Jesus. But tonight I want to focus on the Romans. I want to focus on the Romans, and we're going to start with the soldiers that came to Jesus. Because the question of who is Jesus is the one question that we all have to answer. Every single one of us will answer that question. Who is Jesus? And how you answer that question has eternal consequences. Answer correctly in faith, as I said on Sunday, and you will enter into eternal life. Answer incorrectly, and you will face eternal damnation. Who is Jesus? The best way to find out is to go to the eyewitnesses and see what they say. So let's see what John says about who Jesus is, okay? And we're going to look at the Romans. We're going to look at these soldiers. So let's jump back to John chapter 18, verses 3 through 5. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers, some of those were Romans, some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, they estimate somewhere between 600 to 1,000 people came out to arrest Jesus. 1,000 guys for one man, okay? Keep that in your mind right now, all right? Where do they go? They go right to the place where Jesus would be meeting with his disciples regularly, all right, to the garden. They came with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus knew they were coming. There is no way that from Gethsemane he could not see them come walking out of Jerusalem and see them coming down the hill. There's 1,000 guys with torches, okay? He knew they were coming, but he didn't run away. He didn't run away. He didn't have to run away. Nothing was happening that night that was not beyond his control. Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, right, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. Now, it's easy for us to miss it in our English translations because our English translations add that word he so that we can better understand, right? It's common practice. The ESV actually has a little footnote there that you come down here to the bottom. It says, "I am," right? So whenever they ask for Jesus, he tells them, "I am." Now, if you were here for our Exodus series, right, and we were talking about the burning bush, who else says there, "I am," right? When Moses asked God, "What is your name?" What does he say? "I am who I am." He says, Yahweh. Ironically, in the Greek Septuagint, or I shouldn't say really ironically, but in the Greek Septuagint, Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, has it translated as, when God said to Moses, "I am who I am," he says, "Ego eime." Ego eime. It's a redundant form of saying "I am." And the reason why it does it is because God says, "I am who I am." He says "I am" twice, right? Guess what Jesus says in the garden? He doesn't say ego, right? Let go of my ego. No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say eime, right? No. He uses ego eime. He uses the exact form that we find for the name of God, for Yahweh. They ask, right, for Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, "I am." I am. He says he's Yahweh at this moment. And what do we see happen to these individuals, right? What do we see happen to them? They draw back and fall to the ground. Think about that. These are trained, battle-hardened Roman soldiers. They don't back down to anything. But here they draw back and fall to the ground. I believe that this is because there was some kind of power that was sent out. Whenever God, right, manifests himself, right, the power of God, these men cannot stand in his presence. He says, "I am." The CJB, which is the Complete Jewish Bible, actually translates it as I am. Jesus, this is not the first time he has used this. We will see this over and over and over in the book of John. He continually uses the phrase ego eimi to describe himself. As a matter of fact, in chapter 8, he nearly gets stoned because he says, before Abraham was, I am. And he declares to be Yahweh, right? He's saying, I was in the bush. Which makes sense. Which makes sense because he was there. The angel in the bush. We remember that from our Exodus study. And so whenever he proclaims to be the I am, they fall back. They fall back. And why would this happen, right? Why would Jesus declare himself to be Yahweh in front of these soldiers, right? Why would he do that? Why would there be this power, right, that makes them draw back and fall to the ground? Why? So that he would not lose one of his disciples. Because that's exactly what we see here. The very next line. He says in verse 8, I told you that I am he, or I am. So if you seek me, let these men go. Nothing was happening that night that was beyond Jesus' control. He could have just kept on saying, I am, I am, I am, and then the ice would have just been rolling down the field, right? Nothing was happening that night that was beyond his control. And it's at this moment, ironically, that Peter sees, oh, hey, great. Jesus just declared himself to be the I am. They're all fall down, right? And as they're getting up, what does he do? He pulls his sword out and attacks the high priest's servant, right? What does Jesus say? He goes, put the sword away, right? Peter saw his opportunity and he took it. He was ready to die for Jesus. But we're not going to look at it tonight. He wasn't ready to die like Jesus. He ends up denying him 3 times. No, we'll save that for another night. So whenever they bring Jesus, they bring him to Annas. Annas, the high priest, and I was doing some studying this week. Annas was kind of like the godfather of Jerusalem, okay? He was kind of deposed by the Romans as the high priest, but he still pulled all the strings. His sons-in-laws and his own sons were priests after him all the way down for like generations. Like I think it was 3 generations after this. They continually held the power. And the temple, right? You had to have certain money that you could use there. It had to be certain temple money that did not have a Roman like Caesar on it or anything like that, or any kind of other deities to be used in the temple. And you would go in there and you would buy your goat or your lamb or your doves or your pigeons. Well, guess who was in charge of all that racketeering? It was Annas, right? He was in charge. He owned all of this stuff. So whenever Jesus goes in and flips the tables, obviously he's making the crime lord mad, right? So he goes first to Annas, whom the Jews would see as their high priest, even though he wasn't deposed, right? And so they take him there. And we see that he is interrogated there. And then they take him to Caiaphas. And then they take him finally to Pilate. And when Jesus is before Pilate, do you notice he starts asking Jesus who he is, right? First he asks the Jews, what accusation do you bring against this man? Right? Who is he? What has he done? Pilate wants to know who Jesus is. The leaders, obviously, they don't want to get into specifics, right? Because if it's a theological crime that Jesus has committed, then they can deal with it on their own terms. But if they make him out to be a political, like a political like warrior, right? The king of the Jews, then suddenly it's Pilate's problem. And then Pilate will have to act. And the reason why the religious leaders don't want to just go and have him stoned, because this is so true here. Pilate says right here, you take him and judge him by your own law, in verse 31. And they say, hold on, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. That's not true. That's not true. They stoned Stephen. They would have gladly stoned Jesus in the temple in chapter 8. They could put people to death. But why don't they want to put Jesus to death at this point? Well, number one, unbeknownst to them, they are fulfilling Scripture, right? It was prophesied that Jesus would die on a cross. But number two, right? If they can get Jesus crucified, he's then cursed by the law of Moses. And that's going to dissuade his followers to follow him because he is cursed, right? If they stone him, then the followers will, they'll hold him up as a martyr and continue on his work. But if he is a cursed individual, well, they won't. And so what do we see? We see them want to get Pilate. They want Pilate to crucify him. Because then he'd be hanging from a tree, right? And he would be cursed. Yet that's exactly what Jesus does for us. Is he takes our place on the cross. He takes our curses on the cross. He bears our sins on the cross so that we don't have to. And then he's resurrected, right? He's resurrected. But we'll look at the resurrection on Sunday morning, so you all have to come back, okay? You all have to come back Sunday morning. This is definitely a two-part message in that. So Pilate begins his questioning. Who is Jesus? We see that in verse 33. So Pilate enters his quarters and says, are you the king of the Jews? So somebody has said, hey, he's the king of the Jews, right? Or he's heard it somewhere else. Because he obviously asked that. He says, are you the king of the Jews? What does Jesus say? Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about me? Now, it was according to law, a witness could not bear witness against themselves, right? You could not incriminate yourself. Other people had to say it, right? This is why whenever Jesus says, hey, everybody here has heard what I said in the temple. Ask them. Remember that? We just read it, right? Jesus is saying that because they were breaking the law. They were going against procedure. They were going to use Jesus' own words against him. And that you can't do that according to Jewish law and according to Roman law. And so he's saying, is this just hearsay, Pilate? That I'm the king of the Jews? Or are you saying this because you think I'm the king of the Jews? And he goes, am I a Jew? He's like, what have you done? Right? What have you done? Who are you and what have you done? Why are they beating down my door at 6 in the morning? On a day that's supposed to be a holy day. It's part of the Holy Week, the Passover week, right? It's supposed to be calm. It's supposed to be a nice, calm evening or morning, and here you guys beating down my door, and they're demanding that you die. What did you do, right? Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would have been fighting, right? We see Peter, he was ready to fight, right? Jesus is like, no, no, I have to go. That's why he can say, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate's like, oh, so you are a king. He says, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. You see, Jesus didn't claim to be an earthly king. He didn't deny that he was a king. He didn't claim to be an earthly king. Rather, what did he claim? He claimed to be a messenger of the truth. And if you look back in John chapter 14, you'll see that he declares himself to be the truth, right? John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You see, Jesus is saying, I am the truth. Literally, ego eime, the truth, right? I can't remember the Greek word for truth right now, so you just have to go with what I said. But Pilate, he wants to know, who is Jesus? He wants to know so he can pass judgment on him. And what does Jesus say? He says, I am truth, right? I bear witness to the truth. Pilate at this point flippantly asked, what is truth? And he walks out. And the truth was literally standing right in front of him. And he walks out. The irony of the details in this story. He had the truth standing in front of him, and he just walks away from it. Now, it's interesting at this point. It's interesting that, what does he say? What does Pilate say? I don't have a slide for this, so what does Pilate say? Right here. He goes back to the Jews, and he says, I find no guilt in him. I find no guilt in this man. I find no fault in him in some translations. Why is that important? Because Jesus was our spotless lamb, right? Who was slain for us. The lamb had to be spotless. The Passover lambs had to be spotless. They couldn't have any blemishes. They couldn't have any defects. They had to be spotless. And what does Pilate do? He declares Jesus spotless. Without sin is what he declares right there. Is I find no guilt in him. Jesus was innocent. Yet we are all guilty. That's why this works. That's why Jesus' blood atones for our sins. It's because we are guilty and he wasn't. Pilate still, he wants to know who Jesus is, right? So he brings him out again after they've beaten him and they've flogged him. And they put a crown of thorns. And these aren't little tiny thorns that we have here. These are thorns, okay? They could grow up to a foot long. They put a purple robe on him. He says, behold the man, right? Behold the man. He's ready to let Jesus go. And they say, crucify him. Crucify him. Because their hearts were hard. Their hearts were hardened. You got to remember, these are the religious elite. These are the religious people, the people that should know better, the people that should know God. Crucify him is what they shout. They don't enter into the praetorium lest they not be able to eat the Passover. Remember when I read that? They took Jesus there. They took him to the gate, and then they had the guards come get him because they couldn't enter in without being defiled. And then they wouldn't have... They're like, hold on. Our hands are going to be clean. We can still go eat the Passover. Yet they literally are asking for Jesus' blood. And what do they say? Pilate says, I find no guilt in him. And they answer, we have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Even more afraid, right? His time of being the ruler of Israel had been a kind of a rough one, is the best way to put it. He kept on getting into these squabbles with these Jews, right, that were like hyper-religious and wouldn't allow him to even put up an image of Caesar in Jerusalem, wouldn't allow any of this. There have been people, the tetrarchs of the four sons of Herod had already petitioned the emperor to have this removed. And so Pilate's on thin ice. And now here are all these Jews here demanding this man's blood, who didn't even really claim to be their king, but they're saying he claimed to be their king. And now they say he's the Son of God? Pilate is terrified. Because any way that he plays this is going to be wrong, right? If he lets Jesus go, what do we see? You're no friend of Caesar. We're going to get you deposed, right? We're going to get rid of you. But if he kills the Son of God, he's killed the Son of God. And it's this moment that he asks Jesus, where are you from? And Jesus gives him no answer. In verse 10, we can see the desperation that he has. He says, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you? And it's at this moment that Jesus takes control of the conversation, right? He takes control of the conversation, and he points out to him that Pilate has no authority that has not been given to him from a higher power, right? He has no authority over Jesus that has not been granted to him, and whoever turned Jesus over has the greater sin. Pilate at this point seeks to release him, seeks to release the King of the Jews, the Son of God. He seeks to release him. But that's when the Jews push back. They say, nope, crucify him, lest you not be on the side of Caesar. And so he capitulates and has Jesus crucified to placate the Jews. So who was Jesus, right? Well, in the eyes of the Romans, he was the King of the Jews, but a helpless man hanging on a cross between two other criminals. In the eyes of Pilate, he was innocent, a man who should have been released. In the eyes of the religious Jews, he was a blasphemer and a pretender to the throne. Yet in the text tonight, right, what does John make Jesus out to be, right? He's more than what the world thinks of him, obviously. We see that Jesus claims to be the truth. He claims to be the I am of the old covenant. And he claims to be the Son of God. And he is the Lamb who was slain for us. But how do we know it to be true? How do we know that the claims that Jesus made are true? Because he rose from the dead. The tomb is empty. And the tomb is empty validates every single claim that Jesus has made. And we're going to look at that on Sunday morning. So at this time, we're going to celebrate communion. So let's go ahead and start over here. We celebrate an open communion here. You do not have to be a member